In a world threatened by nuclear war and endless regional conflicts, peacekeeping and security have become one of the United Nations' main priorities. Since 1945, the United Nations has assisted in negotiating more than 170 peace settlements that have ended regional conflicts around the world. The United Nations has used quiet diplomacy to avert imminent wars. The Korean War was the first United Nations involvement in a dispute between sovereign states. From June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, supported by the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, fought against the Republic of Korea, supported by the United States and the United Nations. The Security Council, acting in the absence of the Soviet Union, called on member states to help the southern part of Korea repel invasion from the communist north. On July 7th, 1950, 16 nations under the UN flag formed the United Nations Command, led by American General Douglas MacArthur. Years of fighting and criticism surrounding the presence of UN in the region ended when the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, by the UN Command and the Chinese North Korean Command. One of the greatest challenges the UN faced during the 1960s was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This event put the world the closest it had ever been to nuclear war. American spy planes detected Russian ballistic missiles being built on the communist island of Cuba, 90 miles south of Florida in the U.S. President Kennedy saw this as a threat to the security of the United States. In response, the U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba, preventing Russian ships from getting through. The world waited to see if the Russians would retaliate. The United States took its case to the United Nations Security Council, where Ambassador Adlai E. Stevenson, seated second from the right at the council table here in the picture, presented the case against the Soviet Union. A deal between the United States and Soviet Union was made, and all missiles were removed. Peacekeepers are employed to maintain and or re-establish peace in areas of conflict. UN peacekeepers serve as impartial third parties that are deployed by the Security Council only when all parties of a conflict accept their presence. Peacekeepers help restore or create an atmosphere that allows the negotiating process to go forward, saving millions of people from becoming victims of war. There are two types of peacekeeping operations: unarmed observer groups that gather information and issues, and lightly armed military forces that are allowed to use their weapons only in self defense. Currently, there are 15 peacekeeping operations, with 67 operations having been completed since the founding of the United Nations. Though the root of the problems tends to remain, the UN peacekeepers play a significant role in reducing the level of conflict in troubled regions. United Nations peacekeepers won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1988 for their courageous work in the field. The UN General Assembly endorsed a plan for the division of Palestine into two separate states. A portion of the land would be known as the Jewish state and the other portion known as the Arab state, with Jerusalem remaining under international control. This plan was met with fierce opposition from the Palestinian Arabs and Arab states. On May 14, 1948, the United Kingdom, which presided over Palestine, surrendered its control over the region, and the State of Israel became officially independent. The following day, Palestinians and Arabs began hostile attacks against Israel. The United Nations Truce Supervision Organization was deployed. into the region to act as a mediator between the Palestine and Arab states and Israel after the region was divided into different states. Today, those observers are spread throughout the region, manning posts located in areas where the borders of the divided region are maintained by force. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, triggering events that led to the Gulf War. In response, the Security Council imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. However, Iraq continued to cross Kuwait's border and took a number of British hostages. The Council adopted a series of resolutions mandating Chapter 7 enforcement measures, authorizing member states to use all necessary means to restore peace and security to the area. Council Resolution 678 authorized a U.S. led military coalition. On January 16, 1991, the UN military operation known as Operation Desert Storm launched military action to evict Iraqi troops from Kuwait territory. The coalition forced Iraqi soldiers out of Kuwait City by February 1991. Iraq announced that it would accept all UN resolutions, and the war was declared over by February 28, 1991. Very short war. The Council, in a new resolution numbered 687, imposed conditions on Iraq, including compensation for Kuwait. Iraq was also required to cooperate with the UN Iraq-Kuwait Observer Mission, which monitored the demilitarized zone between the two countries. The Council created the UN Special Commission on Iraq, whose weapons inspectors monitored Iraq's compliance with UN resolutions and verified that it had destroyed any weapons of mass destruction. The economic sanctions continued to ensure Iraq complied with the inspectors. Eventually, under the Oil for Food program, Iraq was allowed to sell limited amounts of oil to buy food, medicine, and other essentials, although according to a 1998 report, ordinary Iraqis suffered higher death rates and ill health as a result of the sanctions. The UN carried out its inspections, although President Saddam Hussein of Iraq never fully cooperated. In 1997, Hussein expelled American members of the inspector team, alleging that they were spies for the U.S. government. Inspections continued until 1998, when Iraq ended its cooperation with the United Nations. A month later, after the United Nations staff were evacuated, the U.S. and British launched a bombing campaign, Operation Desert Fox, to destroy nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The Security Council set up the UN Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission. However, Iraq rejected it. In September 2003, President Bush called on the UN Assembly to confront the growing danger in Iraq. UN weapons inspectors returned, backed with a Security Council resolution which threatened serious consequences if Iraq did not comply. In March 2003, the chief weapons inspector reported to the Security Council that the inspections need more time to verify Iraq's compliance. By then, the stage was set for the American-led invasion of March 2003. April 1975. A communist guerrilla group known as the Khmer Rouge marched victoriously into the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh. Led by Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge ruthlessly implemented radical social and economic policies of communism, which resulted in 2 million people dead and 5 million displaced. In December 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and deposed the regime. Pol Pot and other Khmer Rouge leaders took refuge on the border near Thailand and mounted an insurgency against the Vietnamese-installed government of Hun Sen and the capital. The new government, which was also backed by the Soviet Union, struggled to survive and rebuild the ravaged nation. China, the U.S., and other Western powers who opposed Vietnamese influence in Southeast Asia did not recognize the Hun Sen government. Eventually, after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, members of the Security Council cooperated to address the conflict in Cambodia. A peace treaty was signed in 1991 by all the parties involved in the Cambodian conflict, and in 1992, the Security Council established the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia. Its goal was to supervise the ceasefire and withdrawal of foreign forces, disarm all militia in the region, supervise the establishment of administrative structures, and organize free elections. The United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees oversaw the resettlement of 360,000 refugees and displaced persons. At one point, they had 21,000 military and civilian personnel from more than 100 countries helping. Upon completion of a successful election in 1993 and the establishment of key government infrastructures, the United Nations ended its operation in September 1993. The United Nations' efforts to restore peace in the Congo illustrate the huge challenges when countries are torn by internal conflict. In July 1960, the Congo gained its independence from Belgium, but the country was unprepared. The Congolese army mutinied against the Belgian officers, and when Europeans were attacked, Belgium sent 10,000 paratroopers to protect their civilians. Moshi Shombe, the leader of the Southern Province of Katanga, declared independence. Katanga had rich natural resources, including diamonds, copper, and uranium, and it could make Congo a rich country. The new prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, asked UN Security General to help his fledgling government restore order. The Security Council urged Belgium to withdraw its troops and authorized the United Nations operation in the Congo in July 1960. Its goal was to monitor the withdrawal of foreign troops, protect civilians, and prevent clashes between armed factions. But the UN peacekeepers could use force only in self-defense, and were not allowed to take sides in the conflict. The crisis deepened in late 1960 after Lumumba was murdered by mercenaries. By 1961, four armed factions claimed to lead the Congo. In August 1961, under the leadership of Hammarskjöld, the warring factions agreed to form a new parliament in the capital, Leopoldville. The new prime minister, convinced Tshombe was a great threat to national stability, asked the United Nations to support an attack on Katanga with troops. Tshombe fled to Rhodesia, and Hammarskjöld fled to meet him there. But the security general was killed when his plane crashed. The new Secretary General, Udant, continued to lead peace efforts between the different groups. Little was resolved, and when UN troops attacked Katanga again in 1962, Tshombe fled, and Katanga rejoined the Congo in 1963. Some countries criticized the UN for taking sides to bring peace to the Congo, but it averted civil war, and its humanitarian operations prevented famine and epidemics. Somalia. Since independence in 1960, Somalia has suffered from military coups, disputes with its neighbors, and devastating famine. In 1992, the worst drought of the century in Africa, and a civil war plunged Somalia into a severe famine that killed 300,000 people. The United Nations tried to resolve the conflict along with relief organizations from around the world by delivering humanitarian aid. In November 1992, the Unified Task Force of the United Nations, made up of troops from 24 countries and led by the United States, quickly secured major relief centers and restored order. A UN peacekeeping mission, the United Nations operation in Somalia, was responsible for protecting delivery of aid and political efforts to end the war. In the meantime, the UN organized meetings between 15 Somali political groups who finally agreed to a ceasefire. However, the clans ignored the ceasefire. 24 Pakistani peacekeepers with the UN were killed in the capital of Mogadishu. In October, 18 U.S. soldiers providing backup to the UN Blue Helmets were ambushed by various factions, and their bodies were dragged through the streets. The United States announced it would withdraw its troops from Somalia. Belgium, France, and Sweden also declared to withdraw. While the United Nations humanitarian agencies continued their reconciliation and relief efforts, the Security Council revised its mandate to focus on reconciliation and reconstruction. But faction leaders failed to comply with the ceasefire, and the UN was withdrawn in March 1995. During the 3 years that UN peacekeepers served in Somalia as part of the UN, 157 personnel died. UN humanitarian agencies, such as UNICEF, continued working in Somalia. In 2006, the political factions agreed to meet in Parliament to discuss the future of their country, but fighting broke out later that year, preventing any peace agreement from developing, causing more death and suffering. Rwanda. Rwanda suffered years of post-colonial instability after independence in 1962, with tensions between two groups, the majority Hutu and the minority Tutsi. The two groups signed a power-sharing ceasefire agreement known as the Arusha Accords, sponsored by the United Nations. Unfortunately, tensions continued. In October 1993, the UN Security Council sent a small peacekeeping force. In early April 1994, the president's plane was shot down. The assassination set in motion terrible massacres known as the Rwandan Genocide. Over the next 3 months, extremist Hutu militias slaughtered between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsi and Hutu moderates. Under pressure from its member states, the Security Council then decided to scale back its mission despite protests from the commander on the ground. United Nations member states did not answer the United Nations requests for increased troops and money. The tiny and lightly armed UN force could not stop the killings. The Rwandese Patriotic Front advanced on the capital in July 1994 and declared the war over. During the Rwandan genocide, a staggering number of people were slaughtered, but the international community did not intervene to stop the atrocities. As the UN Security General said, quote, "The world failed the people of Rwanda. Rwandans today continue to struggle with their bloody history. Leaders of the genocide are currently being tried in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda." And our last slide for this lesson is South Africa. In 1948, South Africa adopted an official policy of racial segregation and discrimination known as apartheid. Under this regime, the white minority denied the black majority basic human rights and liberties, such as the right to vote and decide where they would live and work. Both the UN General Assembly and the Security Council repeatedly condemned apartheid as incompatible with the UN Charter. The 1962 resolution described apartheid as a threat to international peace and security and called on member states to break off diplomatic relations with South Africa and stop trading with the country. Another General Assembly resolution in 1970 condemned the evil policy of apartheid as a criminal crime against the conscience and dignity of mankind. After decades of suffering and violent struggle, the South African government began to dismantle the apartheid laws. In 1990, the black leader Nelson Mandela, a man devoted to democracy and freedom, was released after 30 years in prison. In 1992, the UN Observer Mission in South Africa was established to assist South Africa government to move to majority rule. And in 1994, it helped monitor the first multiracial vote, and Mandela was elected president. Here's some discussions for today's video.